I'm really excited to be here today, celebrating the long-awaited reissue of Jack Bruce's iconic debut album, Songs for a Tailor, 55 years after its release. And to honour this special moment, I'm very happy to welcome three wonderful musicians who played on the record. Guitarist Chris Spedding, saxophonist Art Themen, and trumpeter Henry Lowther. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Thanks for asking us.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
I think the first question I had in my mind, because I'm very fascinated about history and memories, was, do you remember the call or the request to be part of the album? And if you do, how did that feel?
I have no memory of the call. I do remember being in Morgan Studios in Willesden with Jack and John Heisman. That's how we did the backing tracks. Funnily, I had no idea how you made records. I was a bit green in those days, and Jack came in and played the piano part to his songs, and John and myself just sort of kind of played along with him. So oddly enough, when we heard all those beautiful songs on that album, I never heard, for instance, Theme from an Imaginary Western. I just heard Jack's piano part with no vocal, no bass. So that was the remarkable memory I hold. I thought, well, maybe this is the way people make records, which more and more, of course, that's how we did make records, usually with just a click track sometimes. So that was my abiding memory of the sessions.
That's really wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't remember a call, but it was almost certainly come through Dick Hextall-Smith, who was, my mentor really. And I think the only reason I was there is through Dick, because as you know, he played with Jack quite a lot. I think when he left Alexis's band, I think Jack went with him, and they were great mates. And then I was the second tenor. I don't mind being the second tenor if Dick is the first.
Well, I knew Jack for a good 6 years before we recorded Songs for a Tailor. I knew Jack when he played with Graham Bond, and I also used to play jazz with Jack, with John, when he used to play double bass. He used to play double bass in the New Jazz Orchestra as well, a big band in those days. And I also enabled him to join Manfred Mann so that he could earn a little bit more money than the £5 gigs he was doing with John Mayall at that time, which he did following Graham's band. So I managed to row him into playing with Manfred Mann. So I'd known Jack for quite a few years before Songs for a Tailor. I presume it was Jack that called me and asked me to do it, but I don't remember.
That's
I
brilliant.
do remember Morgan Studios. I remember the evening of the session. Would you like me to recount my memories?
Yes, please. That would be wonderful.
Henry is the memory man, by the way. He'll remember what sort of curry he had in Brighton 16 years ago. So you're in for a treat. You've got the right man, and I'm sure with Chris as well. But
Lovely.
Sorry, Henry.
I want to hear Henry's story.
I don't think my memory is quite as comprehensive as I suggest, but I do remember the recording session at Morgan Studios in Maybury Gardens in Willesden. At the time, it was just a small studio. Later, it expanded to 4 studios. And the very room where we recorded Songs for a Tailor was actually later became the control booth for a larger studio. I do remember also George Harrison's limousine, his Mercedes limousine, parked outside on the road, this huge Mercedes. And we went in, and because we were the horn section, so what we had to play was an arrangement that Jack had done, a written arrangement for us. However, we couldn't work at first because we had to wait for George Harrison to put his guitar down on the track. And he was having a lot of problems learning it. And eventually we got to record our stuff very late at night, about something like 2 o'clock in the morning. And a week later, we had to redo it because the George Harrison's guitar was out of tune and we had problems with intonation. so we had to redo the horns at a later date. How about that?
That's brilliant.
Tell it like it is, Henry. Don't hold back.
No.
Yeah, I'm just going to give the listeners and the viewers a little bit of context, because some people still aren't aware that George Harrison played on the record on Never Tell Your Mother She's Out of Tune, and he had to use the alter ego L'Angelo Misterioso. So some people still aren't aware that he performed on this album, but yeah, that's a really lovely story. Thank you for sharing that, Henry.
In fact, I have to say that at the time, his guitar, the tuning of his guitar was corrected somehow by some system that Felix Papadi had worked out. And we're talking about 1970 here. We're not talking about this day and age of Pro Tools where all that kind of thing can be done digitally. So what that technology was and how it was achieved, I've got no idea.
Amazing. That's wonderful. I'm going to ask one question from Jimmy Baudelaire, who's writing in from the UK. And he's asked, before the sessions, what were your expectations of Jack's first project after Cream? Is that something that you thought about, like if it was going to be like Cream or something completely unique?
Well, I later on I figured, why did he ask me? I mean, I was in Pete Brown's band, The Battered Ornament, so it was obvious that I was be in that sort of circle, because Pete's his lyricist, Jack's lyricist. I later figured out that London was full of guitar players who wanted to sound like Eric Clapton, and except me. So I figured that Jack, after having played with the man himself, didn't really want an Eric Clapton clone. He wanted somebody who was a different sort of style. And much later, I figured out maybe that's why he asked me. Was that the answer to the question? I can't remember.
Yeah, definitely. I think, yeah, just it's an interesting thing, because I think my dad did really want to do something very different. He always wanted to do something different from previous projects. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I only figured that out in the last sort of couple of years, thinking back on that era.
That's really interesting.
Every guitar player
sorry, go on. No, go on. No, I've got a couple of questions which are quite similar, so I'm going to read them both out and see what that brings up. So Peter Martin Morris asks, how much freedom were you granted in writing your parts? Did Jack present you with the music, or were you encouraged or expected to create your own? And similarly, Daniel Medina, a lifelong fan from Brazil, asks if Jack presented the songs in final form or song demos, and how final were the arrangements at that stage. I think, Chris, you've already touched on it a little bit in terms of, you just listen to Jack play on the piano.
And I would just weave my part in with his piano part,
yeah,
knowing what was going to come later. I remember thinking when I heard the album and I heard Theme from I'm Imagining a Western, I thought, well, that's a great song. If I'd have known that song, I'd have played like this, I'd have done this, or I'd have done that. But obviously that wasn't what Jack had in mind. He wanted me to just react to his piano part. And all I had in terms of a chart was a chord chart. No lines were given, and no instruction, apart from just, here we go, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yeah, I think that's true of the small band tracks, but with the big band tracks, as a kind of hired hand, I think the horns, were presented with music. I don't think there's any sort of scratching of heads and scribbling on manuscript paper, because you can't do that in a studio. For a start, it's too expensive, but also, it's got to be cut and dried before you enter the studio. So I think Never Tell Your Mother You're Out of Tune, Ministry of Bag, and there's another one. I think there were arrangements. And okay, it may have been a little bit of correction by the proper musicians like Henry. This E flat should be E natural, but it was we didn't have to create our parts. Unlike Chris when he was with the small band, I think Chris could wing it because he's got the ability. We had to play parts.
Well, from my own point of view, over many years playing with overdubbing on pop records and rock and roll records, we very often used to have to sort of create our own parts, which is never something I particularly enjoyed, because I used to be anxious to just do the job quickly. But in Jack's case, because he was a trained musician and he was quite capable of writing horn arrangements, so he basically did the whole arrangement and presented us with the music, and all we had to do was read it. So there was no sort of, if you like, creative component to what we did whatsoever.
It's really interesting to listen to that, you know, the different experiences that you know, Chris had, and then the horn arrangements. I remember my dad telling me once, when Never Tell Your Mother, She's Out of Tune was playing, and he said that he'd been really, really inspired by the horn parts of Otis Redding's music, and that he was really inspired by that big band kind of, you know, arranged horn sound. And I think that is obviously something that's really different from Cream, which, you know, didn't have horns in the vast majority of the music.
Well, in fact, of course, the Tamla Motown and the solo, the you know, the soul music records of that era, all the horn parts were done by very, very fine American arrangements.
Yeah.
They wasn't getting musicians in a studio and say, "Can you think of something to play?" I never really enjoyed that experience. You see, when I was asked to do that, think of something to play. You know, sometimes you felt you were being exploited too.
Right.
You know?
I see, yeah.
I mean, in Jack's case, it was he wrote the arrangement, and all we had to do was play it.
That's really interesting. Thank you. So I've got a question from Matthew Brymer in Florida, and he asks if you had any idea of what a groundbreaking album this would become. Like, how much, when you're in the studio recording, what sense do you have of what this might grow to achieve?
I was aware that it was Jack was a major artist, and I hadn't, right at the beginning of my session career, I hadn't really done any big name sessions before, so I was aware that this was my chance to make my mark on the session, which is what happened. I'll be eternally grateful to Jack for putting me on that record. It's opened up the session world for me. I was getting calls after that. So yes, I was kind of aware that it was a big deal. And I was aware that I was a bit green as well, you know, but working with these guys like Felix Papadi and Andy Johns was the engineer, who later became very, very well known.
Yeah. That leads me on to a question from Nicolas Rodrigo from Uruguay, who asks, what was it like to work with Felix Papadi? If anyone's got any memories of that, that would be wonderful.
My first time. So,
sorry.
Yes, my first time, Chris. I think the last time I worked with him, so I can't. Stumm from me. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, me too. I didn't get much input or help from Felix. He was just there. I was aware of his presence because he was a name, you know, with other work that he'd done. I could have used a little help, but I guess what I was doing was what Jack wanted. I just stuck with that thought and got on with it. But yeah, it was a very memorable time for me.
And I don't remember working with him particularly at all. It's quite possible because I did a lot of other things, I worked with him on other occasions, but the way I used to work in those days, I didn't really take that much notice, you know. So I'm not sure. I don't remember working with him at all. I remember seeing.
Yeah. Going back to the last question, I think Henry might be in a position, because he was a sort of sessioneer. He did lots of sessions, and I just wonder whether you felt that the Songs for a Tailor was going to be a hit, because you appear for 3 sessions a day, and were you aware that My Boy Lollipop was going to be a hit, or that Jack's? It's an interesting question.
Well, it is an interesting question. Of course, it was an album. It was for an album rather than a single. I wouldn't have expected it to be a hit because in many ways I would say it was too sophisticated to be a hit. Usually you find the things that personally what I would like wouldn't become hits. So I didn't really expect it to be a big thing at all.
Yeah, you do when you do the workaday sessions. You play on so many songs, and you get union scale for it. And if one of them became a hit, then you'd think, oh, okay, one of them got through the whatever it was, fine. But we didn't used to keep tally like that. This one's going to be a hit. That's
No, right.
Mug's game, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, of course. So Carol Hatchett in London asks, did the album feel radical at the time as it did to her as a 12-year-old listener, or did it follow on from your previous influences?
Pretty radical, I think. It was something quite different from what I'd done. But then I wasn't a regular session player, but certainly of the music I'd experienced at the time, it was something quite different. And, credit to Pete Brown, because the words were, they meant something to the public. But as Henry said, it wasn't necessarily, a sort of universal poetry that people would appreciate. So it was radical, yeah.
Yes, and I would say, of course, I only personally played on that one track, songs, that one track. And of course, I knew Pete Brown. I used to play in his jazz and poetry band way back in about 1967, 68 or something like that. So I knew Pete Brown too, but I never really saw it as being anything radical or not. But I just so, yeah.
It sounds, fair enough.
Actually, if it was radical, it was only because it did have all the hallmarks of competence, and I didn't always come across that in that world.
That's a compliment for sure.
Yeah, talking about Pete, I was actually in Pete Brown's Battered Ornaments, which was his idea of a rock band, and Pete was notable by his absence from those sessions. I think he'd done his work with the lyrics that he wrote, and so in answer to that question, Pete wasn't in evidence during the making of Songs for a Tailor in the studio. Obviously, he'd done a lot with Jack preparing the songs. Obviously,
That's interesting. Okay, so Steve from York, he says, Felix Papadi said that Jack was the driving force behind Cream. His musical timing was legendary in whatever way he played a song. So what is it you guys love or admired about Jack Bruce?
Well, he was definitely a trained classical musician. He did the cello. I think he studied voice as well. So he had this sort of, he could do the operatic thing if needed, which some of the Cream songs you can hear that. So we were in the hands of a very competent musician. Playing wise, his playing was admirable, perfect timing, very, very energetic. So what more can you say? Off you go, chaps. Discuss.
I agree with you. I agree with you, Chris. And what you said is, I would say, but he was also highly creative as well. And of course, I knew him in a previous context with jazz and even free improvised music, and as a double bass player. And I can say we did a broadcast at that time, and he wrote this slow piece called Snow, and it's actually exquisite. It was just written for trumpet, saxophone, drums, and bass. And it's actually quite exceptional, but I don't suppose many people will know that.
Right.
I saw Jack like that too,
Yes,
he did. As Chris has said, he covered the full spectrum, and I think in particular, his work with avant-garde jazz, which Henry is very much associated with. And there's a clip it's on YouTube now, and probably Natascha, you would know where it was recorded. It was free jazz. It was just a quartet, and we were all roaring away, and then ended it, and the audience were, ecstatic. So it's, he had this ability to communicate what is not normally accessible music.
No, I think it's a really interesting point, and I think something that my father really loved to do, was to really explore all of these different types of expression and not to be boxed into, you know, any one genre or one style. And I think maybe that's something that from a commercial perspective or an industry perspective can be challenging, but that's just who he was, and he wouldn't have done it any other way.
And also, I mentioned earlier that he used to play double bass with the New Jazz Orchestra, which was a big band, big jazz band, which was by its title was intended to play new music. And in fact, Jack contributed a big band arrangement in that. I can't remember the name of it now, but I remember he wrote an arrangement for big band, and of course he was the double bass player in that.
That's brilliant.
He was also in the original bass player in the Mike Gibbs orchestra that I think Henry was in that, and Jack was a bass player, and I was a guitar player.
Yes, I remember him playing with Mike Gibbs.
Yeah,
yeah, he wasn't the original bass player, but I remember Roy Babington, I think, might have been, but I do remember Jack doing it. Yeah, playing with Mike.
Yeah, I think Jack was on that first session in Deco where we did Family Joy, Oh Boy.
Yeah.
Later on, when we did the live at Ronnie's, Roy Babington was the bass player. That's how I remember it anyway.
That's brilliant. I mean, I find something that I didn't know about every week while I'm researching and digging through the archives and you know, searching for not new, but old gems that I'm not aware of. And it is quite astounding, I guess. I mean, I'm sure all of you just participated in so many hundreds of sessions, and Jack did do so much session work for his solo work. So yeah, always discovering new things all the time.
Actually, as an arranger, if you like, I also remember Manfred Mann produced an EP called Instrumental Asylum, and Jack took some 4 popular songs of the day and arranged them for Manfred Mann's band, but without Paul Jones, without the vocalist, just instrumental music. And they were all Jack's arrangements.
That's
I Get No Satisfaction, for example, and is one of them. My Generation, The Who, he did the instrumental arrangements for them, recorded with the Manfred Mann band.
Wow, I wasn't aware of that at all.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Thank you. That's brilliant. This is just one of my questions. Do any of you have a personal favourite song from the album?
Well, my personal favourite has got to be Theme from Imaginary Western, because it's just such an outstanding song, lyrically, composition-wise, and I just hope we did it justice when we played it with Jack.
It's beautiful. It really.
I think for me, it's probably Never Tell Your Mother She's Out of Tune, simply because it was just part of the some of the parts was, the whole was greater than the sum of the parts. It was just, it rocked along. And also the arrangement, playing in a tight horn section, with the likes of Henry, who could read anything, Yeah, songs.
On the Never Tell Your Mother, Pete Brown, the lyricist, confided in me that it was a story I told him about my mother when I went to see.
Really? Wow.
She used to sing in the local Bach choir up in Sheffield, and they'd hired a chamber orchestra to play the string parts. And I was complaining that one of the string players was a bit out of tune, and she got so upset that that was the inspiration for Pete Brown's "Never Tell Your Mother She's Out of Tune." I heard that from Pete himself. So
that's amazing. What a great story. Thank you.
Fantastic.
We can reveal that now, 55 years later.
Yeah.
Where the lyrics came from. I love that.
Unfortunately, that's a song that George Harrison played on, not me. So I was absent from that particular session. But Pete
well, not really, because you were the inspiration for the lyrics. So
I influenced myself. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Do you have a favourite, Henry?
Oh, the same one. Don't Tell Your Mother.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. At Jack's tribute concert the year after he passed, we that song was one of the songs that was performed, and Joss Stone sings the track, and she did such a great version of it. It's really, really nice. For anyone that wants to check that out on Spotify, it's really, really good. Okay, so Gary Morgan in Florida asks, did Jack bring any concepts to the sessions that expanded your musical perspectives?
He was very indulgent of what he wasn't laying down the law saying, can you play this, can you play that? He never really gave me any saying, oh, I don't like that bit, or I do like that bit. He was very, very free and easy going. I think what the secret there was, he'd chosen the guys to play, like John Heisman and myself. He knew we would do the right parts, the parts that he was sympathetic, which was another of his talents, to work with guys who played what he wanted them to play without really telling them, which is a rare talent and very much appreciated by us musicians.
Yeah. No, that's lovely. That's really nice.
Can't better that. I think Chris put that into perfectly.
Yeah, I think that was something that I've heard several musicians tell me who worked with my dad, was that he did really value that creative freedom within the parameters of what he'd already decided, I guess. And he only really enjoyed working with the really, you know, the top caliber of musicians. So there wasn't that need to, you know, really micromanage what people were doing. There was that trust and understanding. That's really wonderful. I have a question for Henry, maybe. This is from Stephen Kogel from Christchurch in New Zealand. You may not be able to answer this, but possibly because you've touched on the George Harrison session. Did Jack decide on the strange style that George Harrison played on Never Tell Your Mother She's Out of Tune?
No, I wouldn't know, because I wasn't there. I mean, I was standing outside in the studio or in the pub or something. I don't know, but I wasn't present when George Harrison put his guitar on the track.
I suspected that would be the case. I'm guessing when, you know, those more intimate parts were being laid, or any parts, it would just be the musicians who were actually recording that would be in the in the studio. So we'll never know.
Oh, no.
Art, I have a question for you from Ed Tracy from New Hampshire in the US. And he asks, what was it like leaving the operating room or office to arrive at the recording studio in terms of mental preparation? So to give some background for those who aren't aware, Art is also an orthopedic surgeon. And so I think that's a really interesting duality in life, to continue the medical work and the music work at the same time. So it'll be interesting to hear you speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, obviously I'm asked about that sort of question. They just grew together. So there wasn't a sort of, oh my goodness me, you know, I've got to get to the studio and get my head together and remember the notes for the C minor 7 flat 5. You do them both at the same time. In a way, what's this expression, the Paul Simon tune, One Trick Pony. I'm a two-trick pony, but they didn't, they didn't collide. They didn't sort of affect each other. So if I had an operation that morning, which is down, well, actually, because as Henry said, I'd forgotten that we were recording at 2 a.m. But if I'd been working that day, actually, I probably wouldn't have worked the following day, I have to say, medically. But there wasn't a conflict. You put down the knife and go and pick up the saxophone. That's just, there's nothing magic about it.
Yeah.
Some people do 5 things. I did 2 things a bit. So sorry to, it's you've got to sort of demystify the, sort of the nurse sort of mopping my brow during some intense operation. It wasn't like, it's very cold surgery, a very sort of elective surgery. And the music was something that I loved equally. So they just grew together.
It's really wonderful, I think, to be able to, pursue 2 quite types of professions that people often dedicate their entire lives to. So it's wonderful to see when it's possible to do more than one. It's quite inspiring.
Well,
I have a question for Chris from Hugh Fallon in New York. And he says he would have enjoyed hearing you work with Jack more. How do you feel now about the albums of Jack that you played on and the gigs that followed?
Oh, it was a good period in my professional life. This Harmony Row was the second one I did. And we were doing live shows with a kind of a trio, augmented sometimes by Art and Graham Bond. And it was a very productive and very, what would I say, interesting part of my life. I was doing other things at the same time. You know, it was kind of a pickup band, the Jack Bruce band. I was playing with Nucleus and Mike Gibbs and people like that, and doing all these rock sessions, which is why I ended up doing mostly in the end. And I have good memories of that time. It was Jack was a very energetic man, but in his playing and personally. So playing with him, you just like go on with it and jumped on board, and his energy just took you along. If you weren't ready for it, you might as well pack up and go home. And I found it very stimulating playing with him. You have to keep your wits about you because you never know if he's going to change a tempo or a key on you or put a new chord in or something. So yeah, it was very interesting time of my life and very fond memories of it.
That's brilliant. And we've made it through all of the questions that were submitted. So I guess I'm just going to open the floor to any other memories you have of Jack, not necessarily from this record, but other times you might have played together. I'm just always fascinated to hear the stories about my dad from before I was born and all the interesting things that he got up to musically. So yeah, just I don't know, anything else you want to share would be lovely.
I got a vague memory of going to Hamburg with Jack, and I can't remember who else was in the band, but I was just aware of the relationship between Jack and Ginger, because Ginger sort of came in on the gig, and there was this sort of, from what had been previously a sort of good feel about the gig, and I'm not trying to diss Ginger at all, but suddenly, you know, the atmosphere turned sour. So it was, I don't know why Cream broke up. I mean, you probably know better than I do. But I just remember that, because most of the time it's always a, you know, glorious, warm experience. And then this sort of threatening person arrived and it sort of rather spoiled the evening. That was in Hamburg, I remember. So,
yeah. They did have a very complex relationship, I guess. I'll tell a story just because I think people might enjoy this. So my dad was touring and working with Ginger in America when I was very little. I think I was about 6 years old and my sister was 3. And we were climbing onto the tour bus to see him after not having seen him for a little while. And Ginger was on the bus and he had his legs across the aisle. And I'm holding my sister's hand and I'm coming up the aisle. And I'm like, excuse me. And he just turns around and he says, I fucking hate kids.
That sounds like good.
And that was my first experience. But I have to say that there was something that still, you know, drew my dad to wanting to continue working with Ginger. They were in so many groups together, right from, you know, before Cream, right until, you know, BBM and everything. And I guess there was that, you know, Jack looked up to him as an older brother. He respected him greatly musically. And then there was that kind of complex, I don't know, stuff that, you know, went on.
I have an interesting sort of way of looking at, you know, an experience here, in the sense when Manfred Mann hired Jack on bass, you know, one of the things, once a month, we used to play the Marquee Club, and the Manfred Mann band used to look at the Marquee Club as like playing slightly more sophisticated gigs. In other words, R&B as opposed to pop music. We normally travel around the country and you just do like 3/4 of an hour playing Do Wah Diddy and 4, 3, 2, 1 and all that, and Pretty Flamingo and nothing else. But I remember once when we were at the Marquee Club, Eric Clapton sat in, and that night Eric Clapton went off with Jack and went back to Jack's place in Bracknell Gardens, where he used to live. And the next day when we meet up again to go on to the next gig with Manfred Mann, Jack says, "Don't tell anybody, but Eric came back to my place last night, and we discussed starting a band, and we're going to call it The Cream." They already had the name. And the thing is, I mean, 2 or 3 years earlier, Jack left Graham Bond's band because he fell out with Ginger.
Yeah. Well, Ginger fired him from the band.
It happened, and then he came this morning and talked about forming this new band called The Cream. And I said, "Who's going to be on drums then? It was just a trio." And he said, "Well, Ginger." And I expressed surprise, and he said, "Well," I said, I love Ginger. I remember him saying that. And I also remember they already had it planned when Paul Jones was leaving Manfred Mann. And that's when Jack was going to leave Manfred Mann and start with The Cream. But they had this idea, like drawn from sort of the Dada art movement, where you'd have a stuffed bear, I think, or a polar bear on stage on the side with them when they did gigs. As far as I know, they never actually ever did that, but that was one of the plans I remember him telling me that day.
I have seen a picture of a stuffed bear on the side of one of the stages.
Oh, so they did do it then?
Well, I didn't know the backstory. I think it was shared on Ginger's page by his daughter, Nettie Baker, and there was this bear. So I need to look a bit further into that now. That's
interesting because I remember Jack saying that, but to my knowledge, they never did. But
I thought it was just part of the stage generally. I didn't realise it was something to do with their decision, but that's fascinating.
Yeah, but I didn't know they actually probably did use a bear then, or at least on one occasion. Interesting. But anyway, often I see a lot of debate on Facebook and elsewhere about how did Cream start? How did it get together? Well, that's the definitive story I've just told you.
Wow. No, thank you for sharing. It's really interesting. There's so many different versions of stories out there, and then history kind of takes on its own journey sometimes.
Natascha, I did tell you about Henry's memory, didn't I? I warned you at the beginning.
Yes,
I've got a question for Henry. What's the postcode of the road where Jack lived on that particular occasion?
Well, it would have been NW3 anyway.
Well,
Hampstead postcode.
Brilliant. That's so good.
Actually, they didn't have those postcodes then.
Okay.
Just NW3. So I've told you the whole postcode.
Amazing. He passed the challenge. I guess to wrap up, I would love to hear about any musical adventures that you're still on now. I think that would be really lovely to hear. I think that these long and varied careers are extremely inspiring and fascinating. And I would just love to hear what the most recent thing is that you've done, or something that from the past that you would like people to check out. Anything you want to share?
In the near future, I'll be doing a jazz gig with Art Themen.
Oh no!
Wonderful.
June the 3rd, to be precise.
The Milford Arms. Be there or be square.
Well, I mean, I'm still playing, and I'm still playing in lots of different things. I do gigs with my own band, playing quite a few big bands, and Julian Siegel, Nicky Isles, and the London Jazz Orchestra, which I've been doing for many years, which is a composer's band, really. Yeah, keep going. I go to Finland quite regularly. I'm going in June to do some things in Finland.
That's brilliant. I love it.
So Art, he's still very busy, I know.
Yes, I keep going. It keeps me alive. I don't know. I don't have as wide a spectrum as Henry by any means. So I'm largely in the sort of jazz field. I play regularly with a trio with an organ and often quartets, quintets. But just around the jazz scene, basically in the south of England, I suppose. But I love doing it, and until I'm no longer cutting the mustard, I'll hopefully continue to do it.
That's wonderful.
And of course, I played recently, didn't we, Chris? We did some things together.
Oh yes, we played it in the Hump tribute.
Salute to Humphrey Littleton, yeah.
Yeah, that was a few months ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
I still do the odd session at home here. Nowadays, we don't go to studios. We sit at home with our Pro Tools, and somebody sends me a backing track, and I put my guitar part on and send it back via email along with an invoice. That's how we work now.
Yeah, don't forget the invoice. No, that's brilliant. I love that. I mean, Jack carried on until the year that he died. His last album came out just a few months before.
Oh yeah.
Silver Rails was released in March, and then sadly he left us in the October. And I know that he always just wanted to carry on creating, and he had so many ideas for things that he still wanted to do. After he had his liver transplant, he was put in an induced coma as part of the recovery because he was struggling with this new organ. And during that experience, he had this really surreal, hallucinogenic kind of journey that was going on for several days, weeks. And he spoke about writing a symphony about that experience. Sadly, that wasn't to be in this world, but I love it when the creativity just keeps going. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate this. It's been really wonderful hearing your stories and memories, and I know that this record, Songs for a Tailor, means a lot to many people, and I know my dad was very proud of this album, and I hope that there we go. That's wonderful. I hope that this reissue gives the opportunity for it to be celebrated, and for your wonderful musicianship to be heard, and also for new people to discover this work for the first time. I think that the music's really timeless, and I think it will continue to have its own life. Just thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to reminisce. Really enjoyed it.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
You asked me to a party, to a house just by the moon. You gave me simple loving, the end was much too soon. You asked me to the theater in a place quite near the sun.